everyone. I'm super excited to welcome an amazing investor today with us. She's Dimple Sahni. She's a managing director of impact funds at Anthos Fund and Asset Management, one of the largest single family offices in the world. She leads the firm's strategy on impact portfolio construction and asset allocation. She also serves on the investment committee of Nathan Cummings Foundation. They are one of the leading foundations in economic and racial justice. Dimple wears multiple hats, including that of an LP, but today we are going to talk to her about impact investing and board activism from her personal point of view. Welcome to SheVC. I'm your founder and host, Gayatri. Today's that special day. We have Dimple Sahni with us. Super excited to welcome you, Dimple, on SheVC.
Thanks, Gayatri, for having me, especially after a great International Women's Day. I couldn't be more excited to talk about this topic.
We have known each other for quite some time, and I have been a big fan of your work. You have been a catalyst for change for such a long time. And I believe your journey, especially as an Indian origin person and underrepresented GP and LP, and now you're an impact investor. So you have decades of working in different investment assets, investment banking, emerging markets, technology, and venture capital. How was your journey made you into a DEI board activist across multiple asset classes?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, first, I'm happy to share my journey, and I hope everyone finds parallels in their own journeys. But mine started in India when I was a girl, and I moved to the US when I was 6. So my view of who I was and how I showed up in the world was really framed by being a first generation immigrant. And we moved to the Midwest of the US, to Minnesota, of all places, which is very Nordic. So a lot of blonde hair and blue eyed people. And everyone is named John and Jenny. So I knew I was never going to be that all American girl with a name like Dimple and with having darker skin. And as I really came into my own in high school and college, and definitely in my 20s and 30s, I just owned it more and made it into a competitive advantage. Um, so college was at the University of Chicago, which was my first taste of really being in a diverse environment on the south side of Chicago. I hadn't been around that many African Americans, having been raised in a suburb of Minnesota. So I really became a lot more street smart and aware of just the rainbow that exists in the world. And then my first step in my career was Goldman Sachs in New York. And this was a private, unregulated firm when I joined in the mid 90s. So again, I was one of the very few women on the trading floor and one of the very few people of color on the trading floor. And all of that, I slowly started to build armor and confidence into how to make myself more recognizable with a unique name, with a unique look, while learning the mastery of investing. Um, After Goldman Sachs, I went to the Bay Area in the late 90s as part of the first tech.com boom, and I was part of the founding team of a B2B company in education. As a woman of color entrepreneur, I experienced firsthand what it was like to raise money and have board members who looked nothing like me because they were all men from venture capital in the late 90s. And I remember thinking, how do I get on the other side of the negotiation table and become an investor myself and then be in the boardroom? So after Wharton Business School, that's exactly where my career took me. I wanted to not only be a venture capitalist, but also really exploit the fact that I came from the global South, that I had been an entrepreneur in two sectors, both ed tech and clean tech, which had more social implications. And thankfully, impact investing really came into form in 2007, right around the time I graduated. So it was a very natural track. As an investor, from a GP perspective, now I was buying my way into boards of companies, both in North America and the global South. So I finally was across the negotiation table and I looked around me to see who else I saw in management that looked like me or around the board table. And I think slowly but surely, I encouraged the female CEOs that I was backing, but also other female board members to be more bold about voicing their opinions in the subcommittees or asking and being advocates for real change, like replacing the CEOs. And all of that has culminated now into my career as an LP at a family office where we invest across public, private, and real assets, and we invest globally. So it's been a journey, but I truly believe impact investing is really not only the culmination of everything that I've done, but everything that I am.
That's amazing. And you are shaping as a board activist, especially in the diversity and inclusion phase. I would love to know a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think ever since Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book about leaning in, women became a lot more apparent about when to lean into their gender and when to play it back. And as a woman of color, I think we wanted to not overplay our hand, but the silver lining of certainly the last 2 years with movements like hashtag Time's Up Me Too, hashtag Black Lives Matter, means that people can own their diversity from a position of strength instead of vulnerability and be a lot more vocal about it. And each of us can be an activist in our own right. How I've seen this permeate in my professional career is I've always mentored women, but now I seek out programs where I can mentor women of color or women from the global South who don't have as many role models as we do here in the West or in first world countries. And it shows in my portfolio of the fund managers I invest in, where all else being equal, I will ask explicitly who are the diverse members of your team that are in P&L roles or in partnership roles. So no longer can you say, oh, our head of HR is a woman, or oh, our head of IR is a woman. That's not good enough. And so I'm asking those tough questions because I want people to hold a mirror and have a plan to transition. No one has all the answers. So I make that explicit in my due diligence checklist. And now we're trying to codify it in some of our LPA agreements as well to show that along with ESG, people are going to make movements and have forecasts and goalposts around diversity and inclusion. And on the public board side, it's embodied within what I represent. But when I'm interviewing for public board seats, I also ask, what is the current composition of board members and how much conviction do you have behind having someone like me on the board, because I'm going to be pushing you to continue to increase the diversity and quantify it and qualify it in a way that's a lot more formal. Because if we don't hold ourselves accountable, the world will.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about the big picture. 20% of the global board seats are currently held by women. I mean, it sounds definitely better than before. We have made some progress, but is it good enough? And I would love to know your take, especially the composition when it comes to the private versus the public board seats, because we are seeing there's definitely a lot of activism. Like we're seeing NASDAQ has put out a statement that we need more women on the public board seats. But when it comes to the private market and the private companies, it's also very different. And it's also very different dynamism about the ownership.
Yeah. Well, I'm fortunate that I've been able to get a couple of different vantage points now. Most of my education and work experience was in the US up until recently. 6 years ago, I moved to Europe and the Netherlands, which is a very progressive country with really progressive social norms. And it's the first country I've lived in where there is a truly an egalitarian system between men and women. And I know as many house husbands as I do housewives. And that translates a little bit into the boardroom, but not as much as it should. And then, of course, I'm from Asia originally. So I always have that touch point in terms of both investing there, but having family in Asia, which continues to be a very patriarchal society, even though there's a lot of women running banks in India, for example, and we've had female prime ministers as well. So I think my sense of the geographical comparison is the following. I think that, in Europe, the EU, there is no one EU. There's a lot of tinier countries. So to affect change in the boardroom, it's a little bit easier because achieving scale and achieving those, I don't want to say targets, because they're smaller companies and there's more of an egalitarian social norm with women going into traditional finance roles or staying in the workplace longer or having more flexibility. It's going to be a lot easier to achieve parity. In the US, they can learn from a lot of what Europe is doing, especially behind sectors in or companies that have a lot more of a bigger sustainability or ESG agenda. I think geographies like Asia and Africa and Latin America will continue to lag simply because the pipeline of diverse candidates, both from when you enter out of school into the workplace and you get operating experience that prepares you for being an executive, which then prepares you for the boardroom. It's just a much smaller, narrower funnel. So I think those geographies will continue to lead, which is why I would like to see a lot more cross-pollination between people, and then specifically women and diverse candidates across multiple geographies. So we should have great operators from Africa who are on the boards of European companies bringing that perspective. There's a lot of South-South learning, South-North learning, and of course, learning between Europe and the US, where we continue to push each other farther. And the US brings its size in terms of capital markets and the market cap of companies, but Europe brings its thinking and where it's leapfrogged a lot of companies, countries. So those are some of the discrepancies that I've seen and how countries can learn from each other. But 20% is not good enough. And I think you can have mandates, you can have quotas, but you have to show it actively in promoting women and operating roles, in giving them chances in the boardroom, especially the first time board seats. Um, and some of the differences between public and private, I would say, is as a private investor, you just buy your way in. And it doesn't matter which firm you're at, you've literally bought your way in. So if you happen to be a female in private equity, right, and that's somewhat rarefied air, you can get on the boards very easily, right? And I think public companies will continue to be even more rarefied air because although it's a more transparent company, it can often be a less transparent board placement process.
Yeah.
So many of the prerequisites in public boards require previous public company board experience. And you're always caught with this proverbial catch 22 as well. If you only have private company experience, which might be as good, right, or as substantive, how do you cross that chasm? So I think we really need to start changing how we recruit for public boards, where we recruit from them. And it starts with the existing composition of board members and how they can become advocates.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the biases and the prejudices that plays in effect. It seems, certain countries are ahead of the curve, as you said, encouraging diversity and inclusion, while others, we are still in the US and other areas, we're still lagging. I'm very surprised to say, and I'm very proud to say that in India, it's not a case like that. But again, India is a very different dynamic when it comes to the cities versus villages. But I would love to know your take, like, how does this potentially created imbalance across geography comes in effect when it comes to governance, especially for public companies? Because in public companies, you're not serving a certain geography, you're serving globally. You're a big company, there are a lot of opportunities plays in effect.
Yeah, well, I think, and let's talk about Asia in particular. You have East Asia, China, of course. And let's face it, their government is not very diverse, let alone their corporate boards. And then you have the other big giant, which is India. And then now you have the Southeast Asian contingent in between. I think that funnel I talked about, the patriarchal nature of the society and who goes into the businesses. So typically, there's a lot of family-run businesses, right? There's a lot of conglomerates and privately, tightly held companies, and those are some of the ones that go public as well. So if you think about the ruling families of Asia, whether it's India, China, or Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, it's often the sons of the sons of the sons that go into the family business. So unless you encourage your daughters, wives, sisters, mothers to take an active role, you're not going to change that mix if you want to keep the family control over it, right? Then you're basically just enabling the patriarchal society that underpins eventually the board makeup as well. So I think you're not going to change social norms overnight, but I think the next generation, the millennials certainly want more and they deserve more. So I think girls now in Asia don't see themselves differently than their brothers. They want to go to English speaking schools. They want to go to engineering and math. They want to do STEM. They want to start their own companies and be entrepreneurs and not just work for a big multinational. So I see women delaying choices like having marriage and having kids so that they can have that firm foothold in whatever career that they want. And it starts there. So I think that imbalance is going to change over time, and the delta and the speed at which it happens in the next 5 years is going to be much faster than what was in the last 10 to 15 years. I think in America, certainly, where now race and social justice are really visceral because of things that we've experienced in the last 2 years. And it's history repeating itself. It happened in America in the 60s as well. every now and then we're reminded about the income inequality and the racial inequality that exists. So now you're seeing a lot more programs for getting not just women on boards, but Black women on boards, Latina women on
Right.
boards. Even within diversity and inclusion, there's becoming a hierarchy or a little bit of a tier to make sure that that balance isn't just balanced always towards the model minorities, which is the Indian diaspora and the Asian diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, but also really underserved minorities, including Native American and indigenous populations as well. So I think the US is hyper aware, and now they're integrating it into their schools, into their searches, into their promotion cycles, because their shareholders are, quite
Right.
frankly, expecting more. I think Europe at times can be a little bit more, they think they're already doing a good job. But if you look at the numbers, Europe also still has even further to go to achieve true parity. And this includes the UK and Europe. So you were leading, one might have been leading in the last couple of decades, but now the goalpost continues to move. So Europe should also continue to move with it. And I think Northern Europe will always be a little further ahead again, because the Nordics and the Netherlands, it sets the tone for this egalitarianism that I talked about. Whereas Southern Europe, again, continues to be very patriarchal, has very traditional industries, brick and mortar. You're seeing a lot more tech-enabled industries in the Northern Europe, which helps.
Right, right. I cannot believe I'm coming almost at the end of this interview and asking my last question to you. And this will be about what's the advice that you have, especially for people who are allies to this diversity and inclusion, who wants to bring more diverse board members, advocates of men and women who are currently on public boards and who want to bring parity and also be a catalyst for change. And basically, how do you align that, especially with impact investing and inclusive governance strategies?
Yeah. So the current men and women who are on the public boards become advocates and sponsors, not just mentors, but true advocates and sponsors. So, all of us have diverse and inclusive junior people in our world who have sought advice from us. Start to really take an active role in their development so that when the next board seat comes available, they're really top of mind. And I think it's a more active form of mentorship, being an advocate or a sponsor. um, I would also say on private boards, and this starts with private equity, I suppose. Make sure that, if all else being equal, you give the board seat. If two people worked on a deal and one is a man and one is a woman, make sure that the woman gets the board seat, all else being equal. They've worked on it and tag teamed on it together. It's that first opportunity that's always really, really hard to get. And then I think encourage creation of new subcommittees like ESG, like diversity and inclusion, that goes beyond audit, nomination, governance. Let's break the mold. You can't continue to have the same subcommittees that are not representative of the world as it looks today. As a candidate who wants to ascend to a public or private board, there are educational programs, at business schools, at directors institutes, Harvard and Stanford, NCAD. So look at your local chapter. There's national organizations like the NACD. If you're a woman in Europe, we have women on boards, European women on boards. There's organizations like Level 20, which focus on women in private equity. So find out what are your local resources and band together. So you're an aggregate. You're one of a lot of women, and then your voice gets amplified by the other women in your group. And you can advocate for things like policy change. You can get certifications and programs, and also just develop your own personal brand. And I think impact and ESG plays so nicely into this, because impact investing has, by nature of where we do the work and how we do it, has a diverse workforce. It has diverse partners. It has diverse LPs. So I think it's a wonderful pool to be able to source board candidates for these, what is going to be ESG committees, which will be required on public and private boards, which will be diversity and inclusion committees, which will soon be required in public and private boards. So I think that's a highly targeted, highly curated pool. And those diverse candidates already think globally. They already think about sustainability. And they already think about diversity and inclusion because they're often from the global south. So you're going to be very authentic when you put some of these people into your boards.
That's amazing. So thanks a lot, Dimple, for your time. I think we learned a lot, and I am looking forward to a better number and much more inclusive board, both in the private and the public board seats.
Thanks, Gayatri. Let's check back in 2 years and see how far we've come.